3 in the morning in the Bering Sea. A man is standing on an open deck in the dark with a baseball bat in his hands, hitting the railing. He is not angry. He is breaking ice off it. Every wave that comes over the side throws spray up into a wind that is well below freezing, and that spray does not run off. It freezes where it lands on the rail, on the rigging, on the stack of steel cages on the deck. He has been out there for 20 minutes and he will be out there for another hour, and the boat is leaning very slightly further than it was when he came out. Ask anybody what kills men in this job and they will say the waves, or the cold water, or a steel cage, the weight of a small car swinging on a crane. All of those are real and all of them happen, but the thing that takes whole boats, 6 men at once in the dark with no time to send anything more than a distress signal, is what he is standing out there hitting with a bat. It is not the sea coming in. It is the sea sticking to the outside. So the questions: why does freezing spray sink a boat rather than just making it cold? Why are crab boats specifically the ones it takes when every other vessel in that sea is in the same weather? Why does a crewman have to watch where his own ankles are every time a cage goes over the side? Why can a broken arm out here be a death sentence rather than an injury? And why does a man do 20 hours on that deck for 6 weeks, knowing he might come home with nothing at all? Today we do 1 night on the deck, from the moment the gear goes over the side to the moment the sun comes up, and then the night in February 2017 when a boat exactly like this one went over with all hands. If you want to understand the deadliest job in America and the specific thing that makes it deadly, subscribe now so you do not miss this one or the ones after it. And we start with what is actually on that deck, because the numbers are not what people picture. The thing they are fishing with is called a pot, which is a modest word for what it actually is. It is a steel cage. Depending on the boat and the fishery, it weighs somewhere around 700 to 800 pounds, empty 300 or 400 kilos of welded frame and mesh. They are stacked on the deck in a pile several high when the boat is running, lashed down, and a working boat sets and hauls dozens of them in a shift over and over all night. They are lifted and lowered hydraulically, because nothing human moves that weight, and that is where most of the injuries come from. Not from the lifting failing. From the fact that a pot on the end of a crane, on a deck that is pitching and rolling, becomes a wrecking ball. Anybody standing where it swings is very unlikely to survive the blow, and the deck it swings across is cluttered with gear, wet and moving in 3 directions at once. And there is a second danger with every single pot that goes over the side, and it is the one every deckhand is taught first. The pot has a long line attached to it running to a buoy. When the pot goes over, that line goes with it, fast. And if it has looped around a man's ankle, he goes over the side behind 700 pounds of steel that is on its way to the bottom. That is why a crewman is watching his own feet on a deck where everything else is trying to kill him from above. And a sliding pot is its own category, because a pot does not need a crane to move. When the lashings come off in preparation for setting, that stack is loose on a moving deck. In February 2021, a crewman on a Bering Sea boat was struck by a sliding pot of around 800 pounds. He later died aboard the vessel of his injuries. That is not a historical example, that is recent, in an industry that has spent 50 years getting safer. The shift is as long as the fishing is good, and that means something specific out there. 20 hours on deck is normal during a run. Sleep deprivation is a standing condition rather than an occasional problem, and everybody involved knows what it does. Impaired judgment and slower reactions on a deck where the reaction time available is about the length of a swinging pot. Fatigue is not a comfort issue on a crab boat. It is the mechanism behind a large share of the accidents, and then the surface itself, because everything we have just described is happening on ice. Most of this fishing happens in winter, and when the temperature is below freezing, the ice forms on the decks, the rails, and the gear. Everything is heavier and everything is slippery. So the most common cause of death on these boats is the simplest one in the world: falling overboard. Slick decks, rough seas, and men working fast on a cluttered deck, and the water they fall into is just above freezing, which changes what falling overboard means. Survival time is short, not hours in any useful sense. The cold takes the strength out of a person's arms and hands quickly, and a man in the water without an immersion suit is on a very short clock. There is a documented case of a survivor who held onto a life ring for more than 24 hours before being picked up, and that is remembered precisely because it is extraordinary. Which brings us to the thing nobody thinks about, and it is the reason a broken bone out here is not the same as a broken bone anywhere else. A seriously injured crewman often has to wait hours or days to reach advanced medical care. There is no helicopter overhead and no hospital within reach. The industry's own blunt phrasing is that a broken bone can become a death sentence, not because of the break, but because of the distance and the weather between the deck and a surgeon. And they are doing all of this for a share, not a wage. Crab crews are paid out of the catch, which means a 6-week season with poor fishing pays a man very little for 6 weeks of that deck, and a good season pays extremely well. It is the oldest incentive structure at sea, and it has an obvious consequence. When the fishing is good, nobody wants to stop, and stopping is exactly what the weather sometimes requires. So how dangerous is it in numbers rather than adjectives? Alaskan crab fishing has been ranked the most dangerous job in the United States, ahead of mining and logging. A federal report covering 1992 to 2008 found an average of 58 deaths a year among commercial fishermen at a rate of 128 per 100,000 workers. For Alaska fishing in one measured year, that rate made it roughly 26 times more dangerous than any other occupation in the country. And it used to be worse by a margin that is difficult to believe. In the mid-1970s, the death rate for commercial fishermen reached around 75 times the national average. Everything that has happened since, the rules, the stability requirements, the survival suits, the drills, the changes to how the fishery itself is allocated, has been an attempt to bring that number down. It worked. It is still the deadliest job in the country, and there is one change to how this fishery works that did more for safety than any piece of equipment, and it is not obvious. For years, the season was a race. The grounds opened, every boat went out at once, and it stayed open until a total quota was caught, which meant the fastest crews won, and stopping for weather cost you the season. Every incentive pushed boats out in conditions they should have sat out. When the allocation changed so that a boat held its own share and could catch it when it chose, the race stopped, and the pressure to fish through a storm went with it, which tells you something uncomfortable about how this job used to be dangerous. It was not only the sea. A significant part of the risk was written into the rules, a system that rewarded whoever was willing to be out there in the worst weather. Change the rules, and the deaths fall without a single new piece of hardware. That is the least romantic and most effective safety measure in the history of this fishery. Everything in Section 1 kills men one at a time. What we are about to describe kills crews, and it starts with something completely undramatic. Wind picks up spray off the tops of the waves and throws it over the boat. The air is below freezing. The water in that spray is around freezing, so when it lands on steel, it does not run off. It freezes on contact, in a thin layer, and then the next wave puts another layer on top of it. That is called freezing spray, and the accumulation it produces is called topside ice. The word topside is doing all the work in that phrase, because it does not build up at the waterline. It builds up above it on the rails, the rigging, the mast, the wheelhouse, the antennas, and on everything stacked on the deck, which means every ton of it is being added at the top of the boat, and a boat is a balance between weight low down and weight high up. Add weight high up and you raise the center of gravity, and a boat with a raised center of gravity does not sit lower in the water and carry on. It becomes progressively less willing to come back upright. Every vessel rolls and then rights itself, and the force doing the righting depends on how low its weight sits. Put enough weight up high, and that righting force gets smaller and smaller until a roll it would have shrugged off yesterday takes it past the point of return. The boat does not fill with water and sink, it goes over. And here is why crab boats, specifically, when every other vessel out there is in the same weather, relative to other types of vessel, crab boats have comparatively little reserve buoyancy and freeboard. They sit low and they have less margin to give away. And then there is the detail that makes it worse than the hull shape alone. When they are running to or from the grounds, they have a large pile of steel pots lashed on the open deck. In freezing spray, those pots turn into blocks of ice. Read that again, because it is the mechanism of the whole disaster. A crab pot is mostly empty space and open mesh, Fill that mesh with ice, and every single pot becomes a solid block, weighing several times what it did. And the entire stack of them is sitting high on the deck, exactly where added weight does the most damage. The boat's own gear becomes the thing that turns it over, and it does so by collecting something the crew cannot stop arriving. Which is why the man in the cold open is out there with a bat, and why that is the most dangerous work on the boat. Breaking ice off a vessel in freezing spray means being on an open deck, at night, on an icy surface, on a boat that is already leaning, holding a heavy tool, next to a rail with the Bering Sea on the other side of it. Every hazard in Section 1 is present, and worse. And the alternative to doing it is worse still. And there's a progression to it, which is the part that gives a crew a chance. A boat icing up does not go from normal to capsized in a moment. It develops a list. It gets stiffer, then it gets slower coming back. Experienced crews know the feel of it, and a veteran skipper who thinks his boat is taking on a dangerous list has a well-worn set of options. Turn to change which side the spray is landing on, slow down, break ice, get into the lee of an island, or call the boats around him and the Coast Guard and say what is happening. Which means icing is a hazard with a warning attached, and that is genuinely unusual out there. A swinging pot gives you no warning. A wave over the rail gives you none. A line around an ankle gives you a fraction of a second. Icing gives you hours and a series of decisions and other people you can tell. That is the whole reason the next section exists. Because in 2017, on a boat with a veteran crew, none of that happened. And there is one more measure that matters more than any of the others, and it is worn rather than installed. The immersion suit. A full-body insulated suit a crewman climbs into, designed to keep a person afloat and slow the heat loss in water that is close to freezing. Boats carry them for every man aboard and drill on getting into them, because getting into one takes time that a capsizing does not give you unless you have practiced. It is the single piece of equipment that most often decides who comes home. On the 11th of February 2017, a 98-foot crabber called the Destination was making her way across the Bering Sea toward St. Paul Island. 6 men were aboard. Before that passage, they had spent nearly a month fishing for cod in Alaskan waters, so this was not a green crew at the start of a season. They were transiting through heavy freezing spray conditions that had been forecast by the National Weather Service before they set out. A distress signal was sent from near St. George Island, and then nothing. When rescuers reached the position, they found a debris field and an empty life raft. No survivors were ever recovered. The federal investigation concluded that the vessel had most likely capsized at night in rough seas and gale-force winds because of topside ice accumulation. And the figure attached to that conclusion is the reason this video exists. Reporting on the investigation put the weight of ice she was carrying at roughly 330,000 pounds. That is, around 150 tons, on a 98-foot boat. Sitting above the waterline, in the rigging, and on the pots and over every surface. There is no vessel of that size that stays upright carrying that, and there is no crew that can break that much ice off with hand tools in the time available. And the part that makes this a story rather than a statistic is what the veteran mariners who read that report kept coming back to. Icing and taking on a list is not new. A crew of that experience would have noticed a developing list long before it became dangerous. And a skipper who felt his boat taking on a dangerous list would normally call the boats he was fishing with and the Coast Guard to tell them. If he was reluctant to say it on the radio, he could email people ashore. None of that was done. Nobody knows why. That is the honest end of it, and it is why the investigation's finding is phrased as a likelihood rather than a certainty. Something happened aboard that boat that meant the progression. The list, the stiffness, the phone calls, the decision to turn or run for shelter, either was not noticed or was not acted on, and the families of the men aboard criticized the owner for sending the crew out in those conditions at all, which is a separate question and a fair one. What came out of it was a safety alert, and the content of that alert is the most useful part of this whole story. It set out how icing degrades a vessel's stability, and it did so because the federal investigators concluded that this was a hazard being underestimated across the fleet. Not by that crew specifically, across the fleet, which means the boat that went over was carrying a risk that a lot of other boats were also carrying and had not thought about hard enough, and that is the honest shape of it. Not a rogue skipper and not a freak wave. A well-understood physical process, forecast in advance by the Weather Service, on a class of vessel known to be particularly vulnerable to it, with a documented sequence of warning signs and 6 experienced men who, for reasons nobody will ever establish, did not act on any of it in time. There's an earlier case that shows the same thing from the other direction, and it is worth putting beside it. In January 1995, an 80-foot crabber called the Sugar Bear lost power in the Bering Sea and began to list. The captain ordered the crew into survival suits and sent a mayday. As the boat rolled over, all 6 went into the water. 5 got into an enclosed life raft and were picked up by another fishing vessel within an hour. All 5 lived. The 6th man did not put on an immersion suit. He was found in the water about 2 hours later wearing an undershirt and tights. He could not be revived. Same sea, same class of boat, same kind of failure. 5 men who did the drill and 1 who did not, and the difference between them was a suit. That is what all the regulation since the 1970s has actually been about. Not preventing the boat going over, which cannot be guaranteed, but making sure that when it does, the men aboard have already done the 2 things that keep them alive. So let us close the 3 things this night is built on. The deck kills men one at a time, through swinging steel, lines around ankles, ice underfoot, and water just above freezing, on 20-hour shifts where fatigue does most of the work. The ice kills crews by adding weight where a boat can least afford it, on a class of vessel with the least margin to give away, using the boat's own gear as the collector. And the survival equipment is what decides how many people come home once the first 2 have already happened. And the thing that is not equipment is the same as it is in every one of these stories. Somebody has to notice a list developing while it is still small. Somebody has to decide to turn the boat and lose fishing time, or to run for the lee of an island, or to get on the radio and say something that sounds like an admission, and somebody has to send men out on an open deck with bats to break ice at 3 in the morning and know that this is the safer of the 2 options, which is why men do it, and this is the part that surprises people who have not met them. It is not recklessness, and it is not a death wish. It is the highest pay available to somebody with no qualifications, in a compressed season, with weeks off afterwards, doing work that is unambiguously real. Ask a crab crew why they go, and you get some version of the same answer that a rig hand or a rotary snowplow crew gives. The money is good, the work is honest, and you cannot get it anywhere else, and they go back. That is the detail that says the most about it. The men who survive a capsizing very often return to the fleet. The crews who lost friends in 2017 went out the next season. It is a small industry where everybody knows the names of the boats that did not come back, and they carry on going out. Because 6 weeks on that deck pays for a year, and because the alternative for most of them is nothing like as good. So the next time you see crab on a menu at a price that makes you raise an eyebrow, that is what the price is, not scarcity and not fashion. A steel cage, the weight of a small car, swung on a crane across a moving deck, in the dark, by a man who has been awake for 20 hours and is watching where his own feet are, on a boat that is quietly collecting ice above his head the entire time. Would you take that berth? 6 weeks, 20-hour shifts, paid out of the catch, on the deadliest job in America. Tell us in the comments. Honestly, not bravely. And if this was interesting, subscribe and give it a like. It helps us make more stories about the work that happens where ordinary life is not possible. Next time, the crew of a snowplow train, buried in 4 meters of snow on a mountain pass, tunneling forward into a wall they cannot see through.